Hi everyone, and welcome back to another review. This time I'll be talking about the hybrid solid state and tube amplifier that is the Schiit Layer 2. So I previously talked about the Valhalla 2 a few months ago. That is an OTL tube amplifier, and this is now a hybrid tube solid state amplifier. So talking about their build quality in 2017 seems a bit redundant. They're pretty much a known entity at this point. They favor the minimalist aesthetics compared with other brands, I guess, and they have their tough metal chassis all the time. It's what they're known for, basically. The volume pot, which is not a stepped attenuator, it feels solid to the touch and turns well, I guess. My unit, which was purchased used from a gentleman here in the UK, has socket savers installed. So those two things you see over there, those do not come stock. And this is quite handy because I kept swapping out tubes quite often, and this protects them apparently. So yeah, this thing runs quite hot, depending on which tubes you use. It runs hotter than the Asgard 2, which I've reviewed before, which I once thought was quite toasty. This is part of the tube experience, however, so I'm kind of used to it now. That being said, the List solid state tubes that you can use in this, they make the amp run considerably cooler, but still about the same as the Asgard 2 in terms of warmth. So the edges on this particular unit are quite sharp. I'm not sure why that is. The Valhalla 2 had smoother edges, which are still quite defined, and I feel that this would actually cut if I slips in my hand. So this part of the video you're seeing right now, I had to take extra care not to hurt myself. So also standard Schiit fare, the on-off and gain switches are located in the back, and also the LED is white. And its brightness doesn't bother me so much, but I know some people who have bought special material to dim them. I guess if they're on your desk right in front of you, it might get annoying. So on the topic of lights, interestingly, a large amount of the orange glow that you'll see that comes from the Layer 2 comes from little lights that are on the board itself inside the chassis. Now, not because of the tubes themselves. Now, the tubes do glow, but they don't have this type of tube that this amp uses, they don't have a strong glow to them. Not a very stereotypical, glow that people expect. So Schiit has kept their consumers in mind who want that kind of experience. So they've added little orange LEDs onto the board itself. So let's talk about the sound quality. So the sound of the Layer 2 can be summed up as punchy, dynamic, and a little bit lean. So with the stock tubes, it does not venture into a stereotypical warm and gooey territory, which is often expected when discussing tube amplifiers, but it shares this characteristic with the OTL tube amplifier in Schiit's range, the Valhalla 2, and both amps with stock tubes are kind of lean and bright at times. But the Valhalla 2 has advantages in its wider staging and more laid-back sound, along with its more natural detailed presentation, whereas the Layer 2 is substantially more aggressive in its tone. It has narrower staging and a kind of a more boxed-in sound overall, with detail retrieval being a bit more muted in stock form, again, compared to the Valhalla 2, in order to maintain its own sound signature. That sound signature is one that is very much like a solid-state amplifier, one that is very fast, even compared to my Audio GD NFB28, and very punchy in approach. So the punchiness in the bass reproduction of the Layer 2 is probably one of the first things you'll notice when you listen to it. No matter what tubes I swapped onto it, and more on that later, this characteristic did not dwindle in the slightest, definitely due to the hybrid design and the solid state stage. Now this can prove to be too frantic for some people, however, and you can't quite swap out its ability to be this way. For example, in my Felix Audio Elise OTL tube amplifier, it has 2 slots for power tubes and 2 slots for driver tubes, and both can be rolled with the 2 pairing to a configuration that you like. So you want more punchiness and dynamics, you can use Mullard 6080s on the power tubes on that, for example. You can swap out basically the whole experience is what I'm trying to say. The Layer 2 only has the ability to have the driver tubes swapped out, and thus only gives a kind of illusion of being truly rollable. Now, I'm not discounting the differences, there are several and I'll go into them, but whatever changes are made are tacked onto how the amp sounds on its own, and it will always be fast, punchy, and dynamic. So I don't find the stock 6B Z7 tubes very impressive. They're kind of thin in sound and rather hazy compared to other offerings. There's also a certain uncleanliness to the treble and upper mid-range that I can't shake, especially when using the Focal Utopia. There's also a lack of depth, particularly with percussion instruments like drums, especially toms, which sound really thin and lack the body of a live sound. The treble is also a bit etched and unnaturally hard, and not quite like what someone would expect from tubes, stereotypical or otherwise. I would recommend the Layer 2 if you plan on getting started in the tube building side of this hobby, but if you're on a budget and without consideration for full customizability, power tubes and rectifiers along with the driver tubes. I do recommend that you swap out the stock tubes, however, and fortunately I've had the chance to compare a few sets. So first of all are the Schiit list tubes. Now these are the only alternatives that Schiit themselves sell. The list tubes, which are kind of used on both the Layer 2 and the Mjolnir 2, are designed to turn these hybrid tube amps into fully solid state offerings. What the list tubes do, however, is turn the Layer 2 sound. It kind of solves a problem while introducing a few others, in the Layer 2 at least. So first and foremost, this is the full realization of the Layer 2's design, fast, punchy, and dynamic. While the stock tubes can sound a bit anemic in the bass department, in bass depth, texture, and amount at times, the list tubes introduce a hefty thump to the low end of the amp. The problem is this can overwhelm some headphones that benefit from a more controlled bass experience, something that the Layer 2 manages to do with any of the two pairings that I have. But with the Utopia, it introduces more mid-bass. But with bassier headphones like the ZMF Icon and Atticus, it becomes a bit ridiculous in how much it drowns out everything else. Another reason for this is because the mid-range sounds a bit hollow and lifeless compared to the tube offerings on the Layer 2, including the stock. It almost sounds recessed compared to how the amp usually sounds, leading me to believe that the list might as well be called a V-shaped solid-state option for the amp. So the speed of the list tubes can't be denied, however, and double kick drum patterns in metal music will especially show how relentless they can be. I'm left wondering how this would be a strong enough reason to buy the Layer 2 over another solid-state amplifier, however. I suppose it runs a bit cooler than using tubes, but if that's a consideration for you, if you want to have the list tubes for this. But so far, I feel that it definitely seems like I'm being pretty down on the Layer 2 overall, but that's not so. If anything, I just find the problems with the Schiit offered tubes to counter the need of having a hybrid tube amplifier. Thankfully, I feel that this can be rectified with some cost and some research. So the first aftermarket offering that I'd like to talk about are the Tesla 1960s OEM ECC88 6DJ8 Roznov Czech tubes. That's a mouthful. So put on your party hats because this tube actually emphasizes bass in a bigger way than the list tubes do. But they don't lose much texture and actually extend quite a bit further into the sub-bass region. So the 1960s Teslas have a mellow sound overall, but they don't sound recessed in the mid-range like the list tubes. With a slightly warm tilt, the mid-range also contrasts to the stock 6BZ7 tubes, and the actual cleanliness of the mid-range is superior to the stock tubes, but there is a definite masking of some detail. The bass, however, is one to be heard. On the ZMF headphones, it simply slams hard and does so in a manner that doesn't drown out the mid-range, again, like the list tubes do. It is also quite fast, but I must admit that it decays a bit slower than other examples that I'm talking about today. The bass texture is also quite well done, and it's not as one note as the list tubes. The treble is quite soft but present and not too constrictive. As these are quite inexpensive at about $30 a pair, I would recommend them to anyone who wants a more bass-focused sound that does not sacrifice mid-range at the altar. My criticism of this pairing for the Layer 2 is that it does mask micro detail a fair amount, which is especially noticeable on the Focal Utopia. So as far as fun options go, I would take this over the list tubes if I haven't made that already so obvious. The Genelex E88CC 6922 Golines. Now this, in my opinion, is a must-have tube set if you own the Layer 2, and until recently this was my favorite pairing for the amplifier. The Golines have a stronger tilt towards warmth than the 1960s Teslas, but they lack any audible distortion that was masking detail while using those Czech tubes. The Golines remind me a bit of the Cavalli Liquid Carbon that I used to have, but they benefit from the Layer's fast sound quite heavily, meaning that this will never sound sluggish with any of my headphones. This honestly makes me wonder how it would sound on another amplifier, one that doesn't share the Layer's capabilities of speed. as it honestly sounds like a hybrid itself of a laid-back sound coupled with speed and decent dynamics. The mid-range has a very nice amount of body to it and is quite layered in its approach to sound. Vocals are especially enjoyable to listen to with the Golines, and bass does not extend as far as with the 1960s Teslas, but it has great texture, body, and control regardless. The treble is also far cleaner than the stock tubes or the Teslas, and it isn't etched like the List either. These tubes bring the Layer 2 closest, in my opinion, to the stereotypical warm and gooey sound that people like to talk about when they're talking about tubes. What I commend them for is the ability to do this without losing out on detail retrieval too much, treble clarity, or presence. The lack of audible distortion also adds to its flavor as a top pick in Layer 2 tube rolling. Tesla E88CC 1970s military cross swords gold pin Roznov tubes. Another mouthful. So this tube, I haven't really used it that much because it doesn't do some things as well as other tubes that I have. Basically, this tube's main focus is in the mid-range, but I wouldn't classify it as the cleanest experience out there. It's less grating than the stock tubes, however, due to its less harsh treble, but the bass extension lags behind the 1960s Teslas, and the mid-range body and warmth fall behind the Gold Lions, so this is my least used aftermarket tube. But for what it's worth, it does have a slightly wider stage than those other tubes that I've talked about so far. And it does not share any of the hardness of the stock or List tubes, where both of those are kind of dry. This is a wetter listening experience that has a certain texture that I could describe as slightly sandpapery in the mid-range. There is detail retrieval, but it is kind of rough and uneven. And distorted guitars can sound quite unpolished in presentation. I wouldn't call it a smooth experience, but I found myself lacking it quite a bit with classic rock genres sometimes. It almost multiplies Led Zeppelin's classic rock sound by itself. But beyond that, I don't really use these, I have to admit. Now, for the best pairing that I have in my possession currently. I'll just start this assessment off by saying that these were by a sizable margin the priciest of the aftermarket tubes I'm talking about today. These are the 6H23P Russian reflector tubes. So you can pick some up about a pair for about the same price as the List tubes, which are about $100, maybe slightly more. But these are definitely much more to my liking than the List tubes. This is because these have an impressive amount of detail retrieval, air, and an overall extremely clean sound that this tube pairing has, which other tube pairings, except the Golines, I guess, they don't have. But because of the Golines just being kind of warm tilted, these are more withdrawn in that regard. The mid-range in this is not thick or warm, but it has a silkiness to it that lets vocal harmonies and instrumentation remain effortless and natural in presentation, all coupled with the layer's inherent speed. The bass does take a slight backseat in volume, but it is still controlled, and this is a small trade-off for what it provides overall. So one reason I've noticed that some people prefer tubes is because the very best options will provide a more nuance to recordings. So in this digital age, the average consumer is far removed from any imperfections that may have come about in the past in, say, a vinyl album. So for the general population, the MP3 format has squashed down music to space-saving experiences that chop off information to do so. Yeah, we can have lossless formats, and we have our own chosen DACs that decipher that information for us in a manner that we appreciate, but the end result is too clean and too by the numbers for tube aficionados. After getting this tube set, I realized that there was truth to what I've been seeing others say, that the best tubes are not necessarily warm or gooey, but rather a clean and as clean as a solid state amplifier, but with the added delicate timbre and nuance that comes from a tube option. Indeed, that is the case here, with everything from cleanly picked guitars to pianos sounding better exposed and realistic. There is no added bloom, there is no etched treble, and any sense of artificial sound is gone, with the only remnants being the solid state, punchy, dynamic, etc. stage of the Layer 2 itself, making me wonder how this tube set would sound in other amplifiers. So I highly recommend this to you if you are looking to pick up a Layer 2. As for amping, this is the most powerful single-ended only amplifier that I have reviewed to date in terms of pure wattage. I have no doubts that this will drive planars, and I don't have any on hand currently except for the Odyssey Sign, which is quite easily driven but sounds really nice from this amplifier. It will drive planars to their potential, except for, I guess, the Susvara by Hi-Fi Man or their HE6. So to sum it up, when I reviewed the i5 Pro iCAN a few months ago, I criticized how little change there was between the solid state, tube, and tube plus modes. And I also didn't like how for the price you couldn't open up and switch out the tubes, so you were stuck with those General Electric tubes inside the chassis, and that is basically the only sound you could get. When I reviewed the Schiit Valhalla 2, I did not do any tube rolling on it, and I focused on the stock sound. So this amplifier, this Layer 2 amplifier, is my first experience with rolling tubes, and I honestly believe that this is a safe and simple option for newcomers to this part of the hobby. That being said, it's a bit difficult to recommend the Layer 2 if you only plan on using the stock 6BZ7 tubes, or even the list upgrades. I would encourage you to explore, as there are so many options out there that I have not heard personally, such as the E88cc Siemens Gold pins, made in Germany. Been recommended those a few times, and I haven't heard them personally, but people say they're quite good. I can't review every pairing out there in the world, but I do hope I made it clear that I consider the Russian reflectors and the Genelex Gold lines my favorite of the bunch that I've reviewed today, and the best performers overall. So, unless you insist on the driving power and only have the budget for a single-ended option and don't care about the balanced option that Schiit offers, which is the Schiit Milner 2, I think the Layer 2 is an admirable stepping stone from a background with solid-state amplifiers and into a world of actual tubes, which is a scary but very interesting place, but it can hurt your wallet. Alternatively, if you want a solid-state amplifier with some wiggle room in sound sculpting, and you want to avoid going off the deep end of tube amplifiers, this is a nice option for your purposes as well. So that has been my review of the Schiit Layer 2, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.